The sunlight filtered through the thin curtains of Margaret Wilson's small apartment, casting long shadows across her living room. At 82, Margaret moved slowly but with purpose as she dusted the framed photographs that lined her bookshelf. Each picture told a story. Her wedding day in 1965, the birth of her daughter, family gatherings that grew smaller as the years passed. Her fingers lingered on a black and white photo of a young woman sitting confidently at a grand piano, eyes focused intensely on sheet music. That young woman had been her, once. Before life happened, before choices were made. Margaret glanced at the upright piano tucked against the wall of her living room. The walnut finish had dulled over the decades, and she knew at least 3 keys stuck when pressed too firmly. She hadn't been able to afford a proper tuning in nearly 2 years. Still, every morning she sat on the worn bench and played for 30 minutes. Scales, arpeggios, and sometimes, if her hands weren't too stiff from arthritis, parts of the classical pieces she once performed on proper stages. Her morning ritual completed, Margaret made her way to the kitchen to prepare tea when the phone rang. She rarely received calls these days. Her daughter lived overseas and usually texted, and most of her friends had either passed away or moved to retirement communities. "Hello?" she answered, her voice carrying a hint of suspicion. "Is this Margaret Wilson?" The voice on the other end was bright, enthusiastic, young. "Yes, it is. Wonderful. My name is Diane from Hidden Talents. We're a television show that showcases people with extraordinary abilities that might have gone unnoticed." "Your neighbor mentioned you play the piano?" Margaret frowned. Mrs. Patel from next door had heard her playing last week and commented on it, but Margaret hadn't thought much of the exchange. "I dabble," Margaret said carefully. "Nothing special. Don't be modest. We're doing a special segment on senior citizens who've kept their artistic passions alive. We'd love to have you on the show." Margaret's first instinct was to decline politely. She hadn't performed in public since she was in her 30s. The thought of sitting at a piano while cameras recorded her every mistake made her stomach tighten. "I don't think I'd be comfortable with that," she said. "We understand completely," Diane said smoothly. "Performance anxiety is natural, but our show is all about celebrating talent, not judging it. Plus, we offer a modest appearance fee of $500. The amount caught Margaret's attention. Her Social Security check only stretched so far, and the building manager had just announced another rent increase. $500 would cover the increase for several months and maybe even allow her to finally get her piano tuned. "Could I think about it?" Margaret asked. "Of course. I'll call back tomorrow. But I should mention, we're finalizing this segment soon, so we'd need your decision quickly." After hanging up, Margaret walked to her piano and lifted the lid. Her reflection stared back at her from the glossy black and white keys. When was the last time she'd played for anyone other than herself? 20 years? 30? She placed her fingers on the keys and began to play Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major, a piece she knew by heart. Her fingers moved with surprising grace, muscle memory taking over where conscious thought faltered. For a moment she was transported back to her youth, to practice rooms and recitals and possibilities that stretched endlessly before her. The phone call from Diane came the next day, as promised. Margaret had spent the night thinking about the offer, weighing her fear against the potential benefits. The money would help, certainly, and perhaps after all these years it might be nice to play for an audience again, even if it was just for a television show about seniors with hobbies. "I've decided to accept your invitation," Margaret told Diane. "That's wonderful news," Diane exclaimed. "We'll send a car for you next Wednesday at 9 a.m. The taping usually takes about 4 hours, but we'll make sure you're comfortable. Is there a particular piece you'd like to play?" Margaret considered the question. If she was going to perform again after all these years, she wanted to play something meaningful. Chopin's Ballet No. 1 in G minor, she said. It was ambitious, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. But it had been her signature piece once, long ago. "Perfect," Diane said. "We'll see you Wednesday." What Margaret couldn't see was Diane's expression as she hung up the phone, the smirk that spread across her face as she turned to her colleague. "Got another one," she said, checking Margaret's name off a list. "Elderly lady who thinks she can play Chopin. Should be good for some laughs." The truth was that Hidden Talents had recently undergone a format change. The original concept, showcasing genuinely talented but undiscovered performers, hadn't generated the viewership numbers the network demanded. The new format, suggested by the show's producer Tom Hayes, was proving far more successful. Bring on guests who appeared unimpressive, build up their expectations, then watch them fail spectacularly on camera. The audience loved it. Viewership had tripled in just 2 months. Tom reviewed Margaret's information with satisfaction. Perfect casting, he told Diane. The older ones are great because they get confused under the studio lights, and they usually can't tell when people are laughing at them instead of with them. Back in her apartment, unaware of these conversations, Margaret pulled out yellowed sheet music from an old trunk. The pages of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 were worn, the corners soft from years of turning. She hadn't attempted the piece in its entirety for at least a decade. Her fingers traced the notes on the page before she sat at her piano to practice. The first attempts were disappointing. Her fingers, once nimble and sure, now struggled with the rapid passages. The arthritis in her left hand made stretching for certain chords painful. By evening, frustration had set in, and she closed the piano lid with a sigh. But Margaret had always been stubborn. It was what had gotten her into Juilliard all those years ago. Despite coming from a family where college seemed like an impossible dream, the next morning she woke early and returned to the piano with fresh determination. For the next 5 days, she practiced with the discipline that had once defined her life. 4 hours in the morning, a break for lunch, then 3 more hours in the afternoon. By the 3rd day, her muscle memory began to awaken. By the 5th, she could play through most of the piece without major errors, though not yet with the fire and precision of her youth. On the evening before the taping, Margaret's daughter called from Australia. "You're doing what?" Lisa asked when Margaret mentioned the show. "It's just a small television program about seniors with hobbies," Margaret explained. "Mom, are you sure about this? Some of these shows can be mean." "This one seems very respectful," Margaret assured her. "And they're paying me," Lisa sighed. "Just be careful. Make sure you read anything they want you to sign." After the call, Margaret felt a flicker of doubt. Was she being naive? But the show had seemed so legitimate, and Diane had been so encouraging. She slept poorly that night, dreams filled with forgotten notes and hostile audiences. When morning came, she dressed carefully in her best outfit, a navy blue dress she saved for special occasions, and a pearl necklace that had been a gift from her late husband, Robert. She pulled her silver hair back into a neat bun and applied a touch of lipstick. At precisely 9 a.m., a black car arrived outside her building. The driver, a young man with a bored expression, barely spoke as he helped her into the back seat. The television studio was larger than Margaret had imagined, a sprawling complex on the outskirts of the city. Inside, the hallways buzzed with activity, crew members rushing about with equipment, young production assistants clutching clipboards and coffee cups. Diane met her in the lobby, looking different than Margaret had pictured from their phone conversations. She was younger, perhaps in her mid-20s, with sharp features and an efficiency about her movements that bordered on impatience. "Margaret, so glad you could make it," Diane said, air-kissing beside Margaret's cheek. "We're running a bit behind schedule today, so we'll need to rush through some of the paperwork." She thrust a stack of forms at Margaret. "Standard release forms. Just saying we can air your segment and use your image in promotions." Margaret hesitated, remembering Lisa's warning. "I should read these first." Diane's smile tightened. "Of course, though we are in a hurry. Why don't I walk you to the green room and you can look them over there?" The green room turned out to be a small, windowless space with harsh fluorescent lighting and a few uncomfortable-looking chairs. Margaret sat down and began to carefully read the forms, squinting slightly as she'd forgotten her reading glasses. As she read, a sense of unease grew within her. The language seemed to give the show extensive rights to portray her however they wished. One clause mentioned that the show could edit content for entertainment purposes. When Diane returned 20 minutes later, Margaret had questions. "This part here about editing—" "Oh, that's just standard television language," Diane interrupted. "Every show has that. It's so we can cut for time if necessary." Margaret wasn't entirely convinced, but she also didn't want to seem difficult. After another moment's hesitation, she signed the forms. What Margaret didn't know as she was led from the green room toward makeup and wardrobe was that in another part of the studio, the show's host and judges were being briefed on the day's talents. "Next up is an 82-year-old woman who thinks she can play Chopin," Tom explained, showing them Margaret's photo. "We're calling this one Grandma's Recital. Play it up for laughs, but try to seem sympathetic at first." The host, a former sitcom actor named Patrick Dolan, nodded. Got it. Build her up, then play to the audience when she fumbles. The usual. As Margaret was seated in the makeup chair, blissfully unaware of what awaited her, she felt a flutter of excitement beneath her nervousness. After all these years, she would play for an audience again. For a moment, she was 22 again, preparing for a recital. Full of hope and possibility, she had no idea what was actually waiting for her on stage. The makeup artist, a young woman with purple hair and multiple ear piercings, squinted at Margaret's face under the harsh lights. We'll need to go heavier than usual, she said to her assistant, not bothering to lower her voice. The camera picks up every wrinkle on these older contestants. Margaret sat still, hands folded in her lap, as layers of foundation were applied to her face. The makeup felt thick and foreign, like a mask. She rarely wore more than a touch of lipstick these days. Could you not make it quite so heavy? She asked politely. I don't usually. Trust me, honey, the makeup artist interrupted. You need this. The studio lights are brutal. What the woman didn't say was that she'd been instructed to make Margaret look slightly ridiculous. Too much blush, slightly mismatched foundation, lipstick that extended just beyond her natural lip line. The goal wasn't to make her look better, but to subtly enhance the visual comedy of an elderly woman attempting to play classical piano. In the nearby control room, Tom Hayes reviewed the day's shooting schedule with Patrick Dolan. The host, we've got her playing Chopin's Ballad No. 1, Tom said, smirking. Ambitious piece. Far beyond what someone her age could handle. Patrick nodded, scanning his notes. So the usual approach? Start supportive, then pivot to bemused disbelief? Exactly. We've instructed the judges to be gentle at first, then increasingly pitying. We'll cut to audience reaction shots when she hits the difficult passages. The sound engineers are setting levels to pick up every fumbled note. What's her story? Patrick asked. Anything I can use? Tom flipped through Margaret's intake form. Widowed, lives alone, has a daughter overseas. Claims she studied at Juilliard, but that would have been, 60 years ago? He laughed. Memory plays tricks on the elderly. She probably took a few lessons and built it up in her mind. The wardrobe department had given Margaret a simple black outfit to wear, a slightly outdated style that wouldn't distract from the performance, but also wouldn't do her any favors. The piano is already on stage. Production assistant told her as she was led to a small waiting area. You'll be on after the commercial break. About 40 minutes. Margaret nodded and sat down on an uncomfortable metal chair. Her hands were starting to ache slightly, partly from nerves, partly from the arthritis that had been her constant companion for the past decade. She flexed her fingers, going through silent exercises her piano teacher had taught her long ago. A young man with a clipboard hurried past, then doubled back when he saw her. Oh, you're the piano lady, right? They sent me to check if you need anything. Water? Bathroom break? I'm fine, thank you, Margaret said. But I was wondering if I might see the piano before I go on. Just to get a feel for it? The young man looked uncomfortable. Sorry, not possible. The stage is locked down during the break. Union rules and all that, this was a lie, there was no such rule. The producers simply didn't want Margaret to discover that the piano was deliberately slightly out of tune, with a sticky key or two, to add to the comedic effect. I see, Margaret said, disappointed. She had always preferred to test an unfamiliar instrument before playing it. As she waited, more contestants arrived. A teenage boy with a skateboard, a middle-aged woman in exercise clothes who said she could do extreme yoga, and a pair of twin brothers who performed magic tricks. All were led to different waiting areas, kept separate from each other as per the show's protocol. Through the thin walls, Margaret could hear crew members laughing. She couldn't make out the words, but something about the tone made her uncomfortable. She remembered Lisa's warning and felt a flutter of anxiety. What if this wasn't the respectful showcase Diane had described? Her doubt was interrupted by the appearance of a sound technician, a lanky man with tired eyes. Need to mic you up, he said, holding out a small black device. This clips to your collar. As he attached the microphone, he avoided meeting her eyes. He had been with the show since its original format and disliked the new direction. Something about this elderly woman reminded him of his own grandmother. The piano out there, he said quietly, checking over his shoulder to make sure no one was listening. It's not in the best shape, just so you know. Before Margaret could respond, he was called away by another crew member. Meanwhile, in the studio, The audience was being prepped by the warm-up comedian, a loud man with a talent for whipping people into a frenzy. Next up, we've got a real special treat, he announced. Grandma Moses thinks she's Vladimir Horowitz. The audience laughed on cue. When we come back from break, give her lots of encouragement at the start, but then follow the host's lead, got it? The audience, mostly tourists and locals who had received free tickets, nodded eagerly. They had already seen 3 talents that day. A man who claimed he could speak backward but mostly jumbled his words. A self-proclaimed psychic who failed to guess any of the cards correctly. And a woman who believed she could sing opera but could not hit a single note properly. The crowd had enjoyed the spectacle of failure, the shared experience of second-hand embarrassment. As the minutes ticked by, Margaret tried to center herself. She closed her eyes and mentally played through the opening measures of the ballade. The piece had always moved her, its narrative quality, its emotional journey from melancholy to passion to triumph. Chopin had composed it while in exile from his native Poland, pouring his homesickness and longing into the music. In many ways, Margaret felt a kinship with that emotion. She too lived in a kind of exile, from the life she had once imagined for herself, from the musical career that had once seemed inevitable. A production assistant appeared, startling her from her thoughts. 5 minutes, Mrs. Wilson. We'll need you by the stage entrance. Margaret stood, smoothing down the unfamiliar black outfit. Her heart was racing now, a combination of performance anxiety and excitement. Despite everything, the long wait, the uncomfortable makeup, the strange atmosphere, there was still a part of her that thrilled at the thought of playing for an audience again. The assistant led her down a corridor and into the wings of the stage. From here she could see the bright lights, the judges' table, the host standing center stage talking to the audience. The grand piano waited in a pool of light, its lid raised, exposing the strings and hammers within. And now, she heard Patrick announce, we have a very special guest. She might look like your favorite cookie-baking grandmother, but she claims she can play one of the most difficult pieces in classical piano repertoire. The audience responded with encouraging applause, peppered with a few hoots and whistles. Please welcome Margaret Wilson. The assistant gave her a gentle push, and Margaret walked slowly onto the stage. The lights were blinding, much brighter than she had expected. She squinted slightly, trying to adjust to the glare. The audience seemed a distant blur of faces and movement. Patrick approached, microphone in hand, his smile broad but not reaching his eyes. Margaret, welcome to Hidden Talents. Tell us a little about yourself. Margaret cleared her throat, conscious of the microphone clipped to her collar. Thank you for having me. I'm 82 years old and I've loved the piano all my life. 82? Isn't she adorable, folks? Patrick said to the audience, who responded with appreciative sounds. Turning back to Margaret, he asked, and what will you be playing for us today? Chopin's Ballad No. 1 in G minor, she replied. Patrick's eyebrows shot up in exaggerated surprise. My, that's quite ambitious. Even professional pianists find that challenging. Are you sure you wouldn't prefer something simpler? Perhaps chopsticks? The audience laughed on cue. In the front row, a few people were already taking out their phones, eager to record what they anticipated would be an awkward performance worthy of sharing on social media. Margaret felt a flush of embarrassment, suddenly understanding what was happening. This wasn't a showcase for talent, it was entertainment at her expense. They expected her to fail. They wanted her to fail. For a moment, she considered walking off the stage. But something held her in place. Pride, perhaps, or the memory of who she had once been. The years had taken many things from her, but not her dignity and not her music. I'll play the ballade, she said firmly. Patrick shrugged, glancing knowingly at the audience. Well, folks, you heard it here. Let's see what happens when ambition meets maturity. He gestured toward the piano. The stage is yours, Margaret. As Margaret made her way to the piano, she noticed that it wasn't the top-quality instrument one might expect on a television show. It was a mid-range grand, not properly polished, with visible scratches on its surface. When she sat on the bench, she found it was set slightly too low, making her posture uncomfortable. These were all calculated decisions, small sabotages to ensure she would struggle. The sound technicians exchanged glances as she tested a few keys, discovering that several in the middle register were indeed slightly out of tune, and one stuck momentarily when pressed. Margaret took a deep breath. The deck was stacked against her, the strange piano, the uncomfortable bench, the hostile environment. But as her hands hovered over the keys, a strange calm settled over her. In this moment, it was just her and the music, as it had always been. The judges leaned forward slightly, pens poised over their scorecards, ready to document her failure. The audience waited with bated breath. The camera zoomed in on her hands, old hands, with prominent veins and swollen knuckles, hands that had known both great music and great hardship. Margaret placed her fingers on the keys and began to play the opening notes of Chopin's masterpiece. The first few notes of Chopin's Ballad No. 1 drifted into the studio air, hesitant and soft. Margaret's fingers trembled slightly as they pressed the unfamiliar keys. The piano's action was heavier than she was used to, requiring more force than her old upright at home. One of the middle C keys stuck momentarily, causing a brief, awkward pause. In the control room, Tom Hayes smiled with satisfaction. "Perfect," he murmured to his assistant. "Get ready for the reaction shots." On cue, the director cut to a close-up of one judge raising an eyebrow, then to audience members exchanging glances. "Patrick?" The host stood off to the side of the stage, making a subtle twirling motion with his finger. The signal for the cameraman to focus on Margaret's face, capturing what they expected would be growing embarrassment. For her part, Margaret was indeed struggling. The bench was too low, forcing her to reach up awkwardly to the keys. The studio lights blazed hot on her skin, and she could feel sweat beginning to form under the heavy makeup. Worst of all, she could sense the audience's anticipation, not of beauty but of failure. They were waiting for her to falter, to confirm their preconceptions about an elderly woman attempting something beyond her capabilities. The opening section of the ballade was relatively simple, a melancholy melody over basic accompaniment. Even with the substandard piano and her initial nervousness, Margaret managed it reasonably well. There were a few hesitations, a missed note here and there, but nothing catastrophic. One of the judges, a former boy band member with no classical music knowledge, scribbled surprisingly okay so far on his notepad. Another, a woman chosen more for her television presence than musical expertise, looked faintly disappointed that there hadn't been any major mistakes yet. As Margaret approached the first technically challenging passage, a series of rapid runs up and down the keyboard, she took a deep breath. This was where they expected her to falter. Her arthritic left hand ached in protest as she stretched for a difficult chord. In the front row, a young woman held up her phone, recording what she anticipated would be a viral-worthy disaster. The audience leaned forward slightly. The first run was shaky. Margaret's fingers didn't move as quickly as they once had, and two notes blurred together when they should have been distinct. In the control room, Tom nodded with satisfaction. "Here we go," he said. "Get ready to cut to the judges." But something unexpected happened as Margaret continued to play. With each measure, her hands seemed to remember more, to reconnect with decades of training and passion. Her body gradually adjusted to the uncomfortable bench, finding its own balance. Her ears attuned to the piano's quirks, compensating for the out-of-tune notes. More importantly, something was awakening inside her, a feeling she had almost forgotten. The thrill of performance, the intimacy of sharing music with others, the pure joy of bringing Chopin's notes to life. Her back straightened almost imperceptibly. Her face, initially tense with concentration, began to relax into something like pleasure. By the time she reached the middle section of the piece, Margaret had found her rhythm. Her fingers, which had seemed stiff and uncertain minutes ago, now moved with surprising grace and precision. The sticky keys were still problematic, but she had mentally mapped them and found ways to approach them differently. In the audience, the young woman who had been recording lowered her phone slowly, captivated by the music rather than the anticipated spectacle. Beside her, an older man who had come expecting entertainment of a different kind closed his eyes, transported by the familiar melody. On the judges' panel, confusion began to spread. This wasn't going according to the script. The woman was actually playing well, not perfectly but with obvious skill and deep feeling. "What's happening?" Tom hissed into his headset from the control room. "Why isn't anyone laughing?" The director, uncertain, continued to cut between shots, Margaret's hands dancing across the keyboard, her face now lit with inner concentration, audience members looking increasingly engaged rather than amused. As Margaret approached one of the most difficult passages, a series of complex chords followed by lightning-fast arpeggios, she felt a familiar focus descend over her. The world narrowed to just her hands and the keys. The studio, the audience, the years all fell away. There was only Chopin's magnificent architecture of sound and her place within it. Her left hand, which had been troubling her all morning, found unexpected strength. The arthritis pain receded as muscle memory took over, the memory of countless hours of practice, of performances on better stages than this one. The rapid arpeggios cascaded from her fingers like water, each note distinct yet flowing into the next. There was a moment of pure, crystalline perfection, the kind of moment that reminds listeners why music exists, why it matters. In the third row, a middle-aged woman felt tears spring unexpectedly to her eyes. She couldn't have explained why. She knew nothing about classical music, yet something in the performance had touched something in her, some recognition of beauty, of resilience, of humanity. The sound engineers exchanged glances of disbelief. They had deliberately set the levels to emphasize mistakes, but there were fewer and fewer to capture. Instead, the richness of the Chopin piece filled their headphones. One of them, making a split-second decision, adjusted the mix to better showcase the music rather than undermine it. Patrick, standing in the wings, looked increasingly uncomfortable. This wasn't how these segments usually went. He glanced at his notes, wondering how he could pivot from mockery to something else. As the piece built toward its thunderous climax, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in decades, the pure, unfiltered joy of music made manifest through her own hands. Age, arthritis, anxiety, all were temporarily transcended. In this moment, she was not an 82-year-old widow being set up for ridicule. She was simply a musician, an artist, herself. The final section of the ballad was a whirlwind of emotion and technical demands. Margaret's hands flew across the keyboard with newfound confidence. Yes, there were still imperfections, a few missed notes, a slightly blurred passage, but they were lost in the overall impact of the performance. In the control room, panic was setting in. "This isn't what we planned," Tom said, running a hand through his hair. "What are we supposed to do with this?" His assistant shrugged, as bewildered as everyone else. "It's good television, just different than we expected." The director, a veteran of the industry who had privately disliked the show's new cruel format, smiled slightly. "Just keep the cameras rolling," he said. "This is better than what we planned." One by one, the audience members who had been holding phones to capture a moment of failure lowered their devices, choosing instead to simply experience the performance. The judge, who had been a boy band member, set down his pen, no longer pretending expertise but simply listening. As Margaret approached the final, dramatic chords of the piece, she felt rather than saw the change in the room. The mocking energy had dissipated, replaced by something more genuine: attention, appreciation, respect. The last notes resounded through the studio, powerful and definitive. Then silence, a moment suspended in time where no one moved or spoke. Margaret's hands remained on the keys for a beat, then slowly lifted. She took a breath and looked up for the first time since she had begun playing. What she saw astonished her. The audience was still, expressions rapt. No one was laughing. No one was exchanging knowing glances. The judges were staring at her with what looked like genuine surprise. For a moment, the studio remained in that strange, suspended silence. Then someone in the back row began to applaud. Another person joined in, then another. Within seconds, the entire audience was on their feet, clapping, some cheering. Margaret blinked in confusion. This wasn't the reaction she had expected, had feared when she realized the true nature of the show. She had prepared herself for polite, pitying applause at best, outright mockery at worst. Instead, she was witnessing something that seemed impossible: genuine appreciation, recognition. Patrick, recovering his professional poise, walked onto the stage, his expression a mixture of confusion and newfound respect. He held out a hand to help Margaret rise from the piano bench. "Margaret Wilson, ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice carrying a note of authenticity that had been missing before. The applause continued, showing no signs of diminishing. In the front row, the young woman who had been recording now had tears streaming down her face. Beside her, an elderly man nodded with deep appreciation, one musician recognizing another. Margaret stood beside Patrick, her legs a bit unsteady, her heart racing from the exertion and emotion of the performance. The stage lights no longer seemed so harsh, the makeup no longer so foreign on her skin. For the first time in decades, she felt truly seen. In the control room, the production team scrambled to adapt to this unexpected turn of events. "We need to change the post-performance interview," Tom said urgently into his headset. Patrick, no mockery. "Treat her with respect. Ask about her background. Find out where she learned to play like that." Margaret looked out at the sea of faces, faces that had come expecting entertainment of one kind, but had received something entirely different. She felt a strange mixture of emotions: pride, vindication, joy, and underneath it all, a quiet sorrow for all the years she had let her music lie dormant. As Patrick raised his microphone, preparing to speak, Margaret took a deep breath. Whatever came next would be different than what was planned. She had changed the script simply by being who she truly was, not the caricature they had expected, but a musician with a lifetime of passion and skill, temporarily forgotten but never truly lost. The applause continued for what felt like an eternity to Margaret. She stood beside Patrick, her legs slightly shaky from the emotional experience of performing again after so many years. The audience showed no signs of sitting down or quieting, their appreciation seemingly fueled by the contrast between their initial expectations and what they had actually witnessed. Patrick, ever the professional, finally raised his hands to quiet the crowd. His usual smirk had been replaced by what appeared to be genuine respect. The script he had prepared, full of subtle jabs and condescending compliments, now seemed not just inappropriate but impossible to deliver. "Margaret," he said, his voice softer than his usual booming television persona. That was extraordinary. In the control room, Tom Hayes was frantically rewriting the segment on the fly. "Tell Patrick to ask about her training," he instructed through the earpiece. "We need to know where this came from." Patrick nodded slightly, receiving the instruction. "I think we'd all love to know about your background. Where did you learn to play like that?" Margaret took a deep breath. The adrenaline of performance was beginning to fade, leaving her feeling both elated and exhausted. "I studied at Juilliard," she said simply. "Many years ago." A murmur ran through the audience. One of the judges leaned forward, suddenly interested beyond the parameters of the show's usual format. "Juilliard?" Patrick repeated, genuinely surprised. "The famous music school." Margaret nodded. "I was accepted on scholarship in 1962. I studied there for 4 years. The female judge, who unlike her colleagues actually had some musical background, looked down at her notes with newfound understanding. "That explains the technique," she said into her microphone. "Even with years away from practice, that level of training shows. The foundation is there." Patrick glanced toward the judges' table, then back at Margaret. "Were you a professional pianist after your studies?" A shadow passed over Margaret's face, brief but noticeable to those watching closely. "For a time," she said. "I performed with the City Symphony for 3 seasons. Then life took a different turn." In the audience, people were entirely still, caught up in a story very different from the one they had expected when they filed into the studio that morning. "What happened?" Patrick asked, his curiosity now genuine. Margaret hesitated. These weren't things she often discussed, certainly not with strangers, and definitely not on national television. But something about the moment, the unexpected connection with the audience, the feeling of being truly seen after years of invisibility, loosened something within her. "My husband became ill," she said. "He needed care and we had a young daughter. The concert schedule was demanding, evening performances, weekend matinees, tours. I had to choose." The simplicity with which she stated this life-altering decision hung in the air. There was no self-pity in her voice, no resentment, just the quiet acknowledgement of a path taken and another left behind. "So you gave up your career?" the female judge asked. "I gave up performing professionally," Margaret corrected gently. "I never gave up music. I taught piano from our home while caring for my family. Not as glamorous as concert halls, but those students brought me joy." In the control room, even Tom was silent now, watching the monitors with an expression of confused respect. This wasn't the segment they had planned, but he recognized compelling television when he saw it. Keep going with this, he instructed Patrick through the earpiece. This is gold, Patrick nodded slightly. When was the last time you performed for an audience before today? Margaret thought for a moment. A real performance? Over 40 years ago. My last student recital before we moved to a smaller apartment, without room for a full-sized piano. After that, I just played for myself. The male judge, who had been silent until now, leaned forward. Why Chopin's ballad today? That's one of the most technically demanding pieces in the piano repertoire. A smile touched Margaret's lips. It was the piece I played for my final recital at Juilliard. My professor said I had a special connection to it. She paused, then added softly, I wanted to see if that connection was still there. Patrick, moved despite himself, asked, And was it? Margaret looked down at her hands, old hands that had just accomplished something remarkable. Parts of it, she said honestly. Not exactly as it was, but perhaps something new, something different, something with 40 more years of life behind it. In the audience, a middle-aged man with tears in his eyes stood up. My mother was a pianist, he called out. She gave it up to raise us kids. I wish I could have heard her play like that. Others murmured in agreement. What had begun as a setup for mockery had somehow transformed into something more profound. A moment of shared recognition about paths not taken, talent set aside, the sacrifices of ordinary lives. Patrick, sensing the mood, turned back to Margaret. Would you play something else for us? This wasn't in any script or plan. The show had a tight schedule, with other contestants waiting backstage. But in the control room, Tom made a split-second decision. Let her play, he told the director. We'll edit the show to make room. Cut the skateboard kid if we have to. Margaret looked surprised by the request. Now, I'm not prepared with another piece. Anything, Patrick encouraged. Whatever comes to mind. She hesitated for only a moment before returning to the piano bench. This time she took a moment to adjust it to a more comfortable height. As she sat down, a new confidence was visible in her posture. Her hands hovered over the keys, then settled gently. She began to play Debussy's Clair de Lune, a piece of ethereal beauty. Technically less demanding than the Chopin, but requiring a different kind of sensitivity, a different emotional palette. The studio lights dimmed slightly, a technician's intuitive response to the change in mood. The audience sat in perfect silence as the familiar, dreamlike melody filled the space. Margaret's interpretation was thoughtful, unhurried, intimate. She played as if she were alone in her apartment rather than under the glare of television lights, and somehow this made the performance all the more powerful. When she finished, the applause was different than before, less thunderous, more reverent. Several people were openly weeping. Patrick, visibly moved, helped Margaret from the bench once more. Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret Wilson. The judges, abandoning any pretense of their usual scoring routine, simply stood to join the applause. The female judge approached Margaret directly, taking her hands. I studied piano for 10 years, she said quietly. I never played anything like that. What you have can't be taught. As they moved to commercial break, Patrick guided Margaret toward the backstage area. In the wings, the other contestants watched with expressions ranging from confusion to admiration. The show's format had been broken wide open, and no one quite knew what would happen next. The young producer who had initially recruited Margaret for what was supposed to be humiliating entertainment couldn't meet her eyes. Your daughter called the studio while you were playing, she said instead. Apparently she saw clips on social media. People were live-streaming your performance. Margaret blinked in surprise. Lisa called? From Australia? Diane nodded, handing her a slip of paper with a number. She asked if you could call her back after the taping. In a nearby corner, Patrick was in heated discussion with Tom, who had come down from the control room. We need to rethink the rest of the show, Tom was saying. We can't go back to making fun of people after that. The audience won't accept it, Patrick nodded. I've been saying for weeks that the mean-spirited angle was going to backfire eventually. Margaret was given a bottle of water and escorted to a more comfortable room than the bare waiting area where she'd been kept before. This one had actual cushioned chairs, snacks, and a television monitor showing the studio feed. We'll need you back for the finale, a production assistant told her. The judges want to say a few more things. Left alone, Margaret sank into a chair, suddenly aware of how tired she felt. The emotional and physical exertion of the performance had drained her. Yet underneath the fatigue was a warm, steady glow. The satisfaction of reconnecting with a part of herself she had feared was lost forever. She looked at the slip of paper with the number for Lisa. Her daughter had warned her about shows like this, had been concerned about her mother being made a fool of. What would she say now? As Margaret reached for the phone, she noticed her reflection in a small mirror on the wall. The heavy makeup couldn't hide the smile lines around her eyes or the soft creases of her cheeks, signs of a life lived fully, if not always as planned. For perhaps the first time in many years, she looked at her aged face and felt not regret for youth lost, but pride in the journey taken. Whatever came next, whether this was simply a beautiful moment to be remembered or the beginning of something new, Margaret knew that something fundamental had shifted, not just in how others saw her, but in how she saw herself. The call with Lisa lasted nearly 20 minutes. Her daughter had indeed seen clips of the performance, already spreading across social media platforms with astonishing speed. "Mom, you're trending," Lisa said, her voice a mixture of amazement and pride. "Do you even know what that means?" Margaret laughed softly. "Not really. Is it good? It's incredible. People are sharing your video everywhere. There are comments like, 'This made me call my grandmother and I'm crying at my desk at work.' You've touched something in people." The production assistant knocked lightly, then poked her head into the room. "5 minutes, Mrs. Wilson." Margaret said goodbye to Lisa, promising to call again after the show finished taping. As she was escorted back to the stage, she noticed a different energy in the studio. Staff members who had ignored her earlier now smiled or nodded respectfully. The other contestants regarded her with a mixture of awe and curiosity. The audience greeted her return to the stage with warm applause. The grand piano had been moved to a more central position, spotlit beautifully. Margaret noticed that someone had adjusted the bench to the proper height. Patrick welcomed her back with genuine warmth. "Ladies and gentlemen, Margaret Wilson," he gestured to the judges' table. "Our panel has something they'd like to say." The female judge spoke first, her earlier skepticism replaced by earnest admiration. "Margaret, what we witnessed today was not just technical skill but artistry of the highest order. Your performance reminded all of us why we love music, its power to move us, to connect us with something larger than ourselves." The male judge, who had been mostly silent earlier, leaned forward. "I've been on this show for 3 seasons and I've never been as moved as I was today. You've given us all a gift." The third judge, the former boy band member, simply said, "I called my mother during the break to tell her I love her. That's what your music made me want to do." Margaret felt a rush of emotion at these unexpected words. The cynical setup that had brought her here seemed to have dissolved completely, replaced by something authentic and surprisingly tender. Patrick turned to address the audience. "Today has been different than what we planned." A murmur of knowing laughter rippled through the crowd. "But I think we've all been part of something special. Sometimes television surprises even those of us who make it." He turned back to Margaret. "We normally declare a winner at the end of each episode with a small cash prize. But today we'd like to do something different." Tom Hayes appeared from backstage, no longer the cynical producer, but seeming genuinely transformed by what had transpired. He carried a folder which he handed to Patrick. "Margaret," Patrick said, opening the folder, "a representative from Steinway & Sons was in our audience today. They would like to present you with a gift, a brand new baby grand piano delivered to your home." Gasps and applause erupted from the audience. Margaret's hand flew to her mouth in shock. "That's very generous," she managed, "but my apartment is too small." "They've thought of that," Patrick continued. "The gift includes 1 year of studio time at their downtown location, where you can play whenever you wish on any of their concert grands." The female judge stood up. "And if I may add, I'm on the board of the community music school. We would be honored if you would consider teaching a master class for our advanced students. Paid, of course." Margaret felt overwhelmed. Just hours ago, she had been a lonely widow with an out-of-tune piano and mounting bills. Now strangers were offering her opportunities she had long ago stopped allowing herself to dream about. "I don't know what to say," she admitted. "Say yes," Patrick encouraged, the audience applauding in agreement. Margaret nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Yes, thank you." As the show wrapped up, Margaret was surprised to find herself surrounded by audience members asking for photos. sharing stories of their own musical experiences or those of their parents and grandparents. Young people told her she had inspired them to practice their instruments. Older viewers thanked her for representing them with dignity and excellence. A well-dressed woman in her 40s introduced herself as a representative from a recording company. "We specialize in classical recordings," she explained, handing Margaret a business card. "We'd love to discuss the possibility of an album, perhaps Chopin preludes or whatever you feel connected to. No pressure, but the offer is there." By the time Margaret finally left the studio, the afternoon sun was low in the sky. A car waited to take her home, a proper town car this time, not the basic transportation that had brought her. The driver treated her with deference, asking if she was comfortable, if the temperature was to her liking. From the radio, Margaret could hear a news report mentioning an extraordinary moment on today's episode of Hidden Talents, and where an 82-year-old pianist stunned the audience. Back in her apartment, Margaret felt as if she had entered a stranger's home. The familiar surroundings, the worn furniture, the faded photographs, the old upright piano in the corner seemed somehow different, as if viewed through new eyes. She sat at her piano, running her fingers lightly over the keys without pressing them. Today had been extraordinary, but what would tomorrow bring? Was this a lovely anomaly, a bright spot in the twilight of her life? Or was it something else, a door reopening to a path she had left decades ago? Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Lisa again, bursting with news. "Mom, it's unbelievable. Your clips have millions of views already. News outlets are asking for interviews. Someone started a GoFundMe to get your piano properly tuned, but it's already raised enough to buy 10 new pianos." Margaret listened in bewilderment as her daughter outlined the social media storm that had been brewing all afternoon. Hashtags, viral shares, reaction videos, a digital world that Margaret barely understood had embraced her story with astonishing enthusiasm. "People are saying the most beautiful things," Lisa continued, "about how you've inspired them, how they're calling their parents and grandparents, how they're picking up instruments they haven't touched in years." After the call ended, Margaret sat in the gathering darkness of her living room, trying to process everything that had happened. From the street below came the usual city sounds: traffic, distant sirens, the murmur of pedestrians. The world continued as normal, yet something fundamental had shifted. Her doorbell rang. Puzzled, she rarely had visitors. Margaret went to answer it. A delivery person stood there with a large bouquet of flowers. "Margaret Wilson?" he asked. She nodded, accepting the beautiful arrangement. The card read simply, "From the community of musicians who never forgot the joy of playing. Welcome back." There was no signature, no indication of who had sent them. Perhaps it was someone from the show, or someone who had seen her performance online. It didn't really matter. The gesture spoke to something larger: the invisible connections between people who share a passion, who understand what it means to be moved by music. Margaret placed the flowers on her coffee table and returned to her piano. This time she sat on the bench and began to play, softly at first, then with growing confidence. Not Chopin's challenging ballade or Debussy's ethereal Clair de Lune, but a simple piece she had composed herself decades ago, when Lisa was a baby. She had written it during late-night feedings, humming the melody to soothe her daughter back to sleep. She hadn't played it in years, but her fingers remembered. As the gentle notes filled her apartment, Margaret felt a sense of completion, of things coming full circle. Her phone pinged with a text message from an unknown number. It was from the sound technician at the show, the one who had warned her about the piano. "Just wanted to say your performance changed things here," he wrote. "Meeting tomorrow about the show's format. Tom talking about celebrating real talent with dignity from now on." "You did that. Thank you." Margaret smiled as she set the phone aside. The future suddenly seemed wider, filled with new possibilities she hadn't allowed herself to imagine. Perhaps she would teach those master classes. Perhaps she would make a recording. Perhaps she would simply enjoy playing on a properly tuned piano again. Whatever came next, she had reclaimed something precious. Not just her music, but her voice, her visibility in the world. She had reminded others and herself that talent doesn't diminish with age, that passion doesn't have an expiration date.